Hello and warm greetings, everyone. I am Amy, your MC for today, and we thank you so much for joining today's virtual talk and book launch of Dynamic Decisions, Energy Pivot, Adaptive Moves, Winning BOUNCE by Ricardo Barcelona. And just to let you know that this event is actually being organized by World Scientific Publishing. Yeah, so for a few housekeeping rules. So for today's guests, we would really like to welcome and honor Dr. Ricardo G. Barcelona, who is actually the author of the book Dynamic Decisions, and he is also the author of another book called Energy Investments. He himself is a key player in the research of energy sustainability, has a global experience as well as deep European insight for the energy industry. Our next special guest is actually Professor Volko de Jong, who is also the ambassador of the New Energy Coalition Business School, and he has experience as an energy executive and director within the industry. And lastly, for today's moderator, I would like to welcome Professor Rama Velamuri. He's currently the Dean and Professor of Mahindra University, and he also has experience as a teacher, a leader, and entrepreneur in business and finance. Yes, so with that, I would like to also invite our Marketing Director of World Scientific, Ms. Koo Ee-hong, to give a few words about today's event.
All right, thanks, Amy. Thank you so much. World Scientific is very pleased to publish the book Dynamic Decisions by Dr. Ricardo Barcelona. Now, against a backdrop of fast-changing business and environmental climates, managers may often misread signals and misdiagnose the risk of ambiguous markets. Now, to mitigate this, the concepts presented in the book turn such uncertainties into opportunities. The author in this book illustrates the various ways that managers could repurpose, reframe, and then reconfigure their way to tomorrow's profitable niches. Now, this is essentially a very important read for business managers and policymakers. So we are very proud to add this to our business publishing program. I congratulate Dr. Barcelona on the successful publication of this book, and I think that we will have a very engaging, interactive session today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ee-hong. So moving on, let me hand this over to Dr. Ricardo, who is the author of today's book. And Dr. Ricardo, it's all yours.
Okay, so let's start with the first slide, yeah, and go to the nuts and bolts of today's conversation. Yeah. So what I'll focus on is probably to focus on a number of the takeaway that we can expect readers of Dynamic Decisions to be able to take after, say, reading a few chapters or reading the entire book. Yeah. So Dynamic Decisions, as a title, as a subtitle, is showing getting there by acting today. I think another way of framing that is how can managers create tomorrow's profitable niches today? So next slide, please. If we start with a little bit of history, time and again, at least in the last 2 centuries, humanity probably has always been facing what was considered in their own times the existential threats. So we start, for example, in an earlier era, which is probably a little less than 2 centuries ago, when animal power was actually being used to ferry goods, people from one place to another to help in the performance of the work of humans. Yeah. One of the unfortunate byproduct of using animals for work and for transport is the horse manure. Yeah? And if one would remember a little bit of the history, back in 1865, the first alarm was being called. And one can only imagine when one talks about horse manure crisis, I think one of the forecasts at that time appeared in the Times, which is a London newspaper, basically predicting that in no time at all, London, as well as many of the urban centers in the United States and in Europe, would probably be buried 9 feet deep in horse manure. Yeah. And if you're buried 9 feet deep in horse manure, the consequences to health is indeed existential. Yeah. Now, so what happens during the time? Yeah. I can only imagine that business leaders and policy leaders were already organizing conferences after conferences, probably not in the same scale as we're having now or as we're seeing now, because it's a lot less convenient to be traveling from one place to another, but large conferences probably to address the wicked problems where only wicked solutions, yeah, could be derived from those conversations. But there was somebody out there in Detroit tinkering in their own workshops, working in the periphery, doing some innovation. And that person is no other than Henry Ford. Yeah. So what Henry Ford was basically just to introduce a different way of producing cars, and with the successful introduction of mass-produced, affordable vehicle that is using fossil fuel. At that time, it was internal combustion engines, and with internal combustion engines, we're basically using oil. Yeah. So two things happened at the time. The horse manure became obsolete, and second, the coal basically was dethroned over time and replaced by oil. Now, fast forward to another era, which is probably closer to living memory for most of the people in the audience, at least in most of the people who are involved in energy conversations today. Back in 1973, we had the Arab oil embargo, and with that embargo, again, the existential threat would be, when are we going to run out of oil? And once we run out of oil, what are we going to do? Is this the end of life as we know it? Is this the end of progress as we know it? Of course, one can understand the concern, because over almost a century before the Arab oil embargo, the whole progress of humanity and human society was really driven by the availability of coal and subsequently by the availability of oil, yeah, which is affordable. Then the rest of that became part of history. So most of the countries in Europe, at least, transitioned into gas, and gas, from being a byproduct of the oil exploration and the oil refining business, gas became a mainstream fuel to substitute for oil. And so nowadays, when we look at some countries, power generation, for instance, would hardly use any coal or would hardly use any oil. There's one country, of course, which is an exception to that, or probably a couple of countries. One is France. Bereft of any natural resources of their own, the French decided to go nuclear, and the reason or the choice for nuclear is essentially based on the belief that the French industry is very good at engineering, and as a consequence of that, nuclear is where engineering becomes part of the competitive edge. Then on a smaller scale, although at that time, when the acid rains became a concern, especially in Germany and in Northern Europe, there was a bit of an alarm that the forests are dying. And as the forests are dying, then we have to find ways of probably trying to correct that. So here the conversation started to move from one thing to another, which is from climate cooling to climate warming, and eventually it became climate change as the ultimate as the ultimate outcome of that conversation, which brings us to where we are today. Are we now looking at the tail end of a countdown to 2030? Yeah? If nothing happens, if nothing changes, then what? Well, there are certain groups of people who are basically suggesting that if we are unsuccessful in probably controlling or doing something positive to control climate change, then 2030 is probably the first decade we will start seeing climate or temperature will be going beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, where even 3 or 4 degrees Celsius centigrade will be a prospect. Yeah. No, so in all of this, one thing has become pretty clear. Yeah, that the discussion has always been driven by a very linear decision mindset. And with the linear decision mindset, one tries to reassert predictability. And what I have in mind here is really the conventional capital budgeting concepts manifested by the work around net present values or internal rate of returns, where in order to project for the next 20 years, for the next 25 years, which is usually the lifespan of most of the energy assets, one could presume that there is omniscience that actually doesn't exist. Yeah, and that omniscience could be manifested by the mentality that there is everything that needs to be known is already known. And because we have perfect foresight, otherwise we would not be able to project what the payoff would look like, nor can we project with some accuracy what the cash flow would look like in the next 20 to 25 years. Then we start committing to rigid obligations. But the consequence of that, as experience have shown, it only hastens obsolescence. So this brings us to the next question, which we'll see in the next slide. If we're sitting here today, what are some of the transition pathways that we can look at? Yeah. So in dynamic decisions, I have actually identified at the very least 5 very important pathways going forward. Yeah. And none of this would probably work with a very rigid, linear decision-making mindset, but rather what it would require is the ability to change course when conditions change. And the other one, which is rather more important, is to fully understand and fully appreciate the differences of the characteristics of different technologies. So let's take it one at a time. If we're talking about hydropower or geothermal power, the strategy or the consequences of being an early mover is actually quite important. And the reason it is important to be an early mover, to seize the advantages when one talks about hydropower, geothermal, is because most of these resources are geocentric or location specific. So if you're location specific, and you're the first one to lock in a position in some of the preferred sites, and the preferred sites would be there's an abundance of hydropower, there's an abundance of geothermal steam, then there is a potential or a prospect of locking out the rivals who are coming late. And those who are coming late will probably get the less preferred locations, and therefore the output that one could expect would be also a lot less. Then one advantages of that, of course, is that under a centralized network configuration, which is characterized by the present energy system, then the capacity of hydro production and geothermal power production to be integrated to use existing networks is a big advantage. The other aspect, of course, is the role of gas. So where is gas fitting into the whole scheme of things? Well, substitution is a very important aspect to consider. And what are we substituting with what? Yes, so I'm really thinking of looking back a few decades back. The first substitution was really from coal to oil, and then nowadays it's from oil to combined cycle gas power generation, and also the introduction of clean fuels and synthetic gas. Now, the driving force behind this is really to reduce the CO2 emissions. And one way to reduce the CO2 emissions is to replace coal with gas. And we have seen that, for example, in countries like Spain, the UK, and even Germany, who has probably gone farther than just simply substituting gas into promoting renewable energy in a very massive and aggressive way. Then we can see that in reality, for a lot of these countries, while they're still concerned about CO2 emissions, over the last 2 decades, the level of emissions has actually been declining. Yeah? But of course, it doesn't help if some of the more, shall we say, high growth economies continue to see emissions rising as economic growth continue to be at very high level. Now, there are certain technologies, of course, that are still intermittent, and there are certain technologies that would need adaptation, in order to fit in to a centralized system. And this is where the existing network could hinder, or with some changes, or certain changes in the existing network to distribute power from the point of production to the point of consumption, certain technologies could be accommodated. And this is going to be probably a process of adaptation, where one type of technology would gain some foothold, and some technologies are probably would take more time before they can be incorporated. So I'm really referring more to the experience of onshore wind, and looking at the Spanish system. This is probably one of the very few countries where a renewable subsystem has actually facilitated the integration of intermittent wind, and to a lesser extent intermittent solar power, to become one of the mainstream sources of supply. Just to give you some kind of background, Spain is probably one of the few countries where wind, and to a lesser extent solar, are contributing anywhere from 25 to 30% of the total power being produced in the case of wind, and anywhere from 8 to 15% for solar. And all of that was happening in a matter of a very few years in the scheme of energy transition. Because all of this has been achieved in the last 10 to 15 years. Whereas in the case of gas, it took gas about 3 decades to get into a position of relevance. Now, what we do with some of the technologies where inefficiency could be an issue or cost could be an issue. This is what I call companies or people adopting these technologies would benefit from some kind of a pacing of the inclusion in their portfolio. So, for example, in the case of photovoltaic solar power, while the media and the business press are saying, or at least suggesting, that photovoltaic solar power are now cheaper and more competitive compared to coal, then it raises a very legitimate strategic question. If that is the case, why is it that companies and most systems in the world, with a few exceptions, are very slow in adopting solar power? I think the work that I have done in writing Dynamic Decisions has actually uncovered part of the puzzle by just simply doing some simple calculation. And the calculation I've done is, if the capital expenditure or the cost of installation is falling by about 15 to 20% per year, and this is a highly capital intensive kind of technology, where the cost is mostly fixed costs, because fuel cost is zero for solar, then the question becomes, what am I foregoing as an investor if I postpone building a solar farm? Well, the foregone cost of that is the foregone opportunity cost. Rather, the foregone opportunity cost is a revenue that one does not collect or does not earn by deferring an investment. And with solar power having an efficiency rate of converting sunlight into power at a relatively low rate of about anywhere from 15 to 22%, then the foregone revenue tends to be pretty small. So it is better to wait, and by waiting, let's say 2 or 3 years, one would already make the early movers in solar power or in solar installation obsolete, or at least uncompetitive, or rendered uncompetitive. Now, in the case of offshore wind is probably following a similar kind of pattern, where the capital expenditure is falling rather fast with technological advancement and reconfiguration in how offshore wind is being installed. The costs are falling rapidly. Then one can simply say, well, is there a additional cost for, or is there a high cost for postponing the commitment into offshore wind? Well, in this particular case, the jury is still out, because in the case of offshore wind, the conversion of wind into power is now reaching 65%. And at 65%, it is almost the efficiency of a combined cycle gas turbine run as a mid-merit plant. And eventually, the question about what do you use the excess power from offshore wind, is it going to be used? Then this is where the question of hydrogen comes into the picture. So in terms of a strategic way of looking at this, I think one contribution that dynamic decisions have is the identification of a term which I would refer to as the late movers benefits. And that is more to solar power or technologies that are emerging, but where the capital and installation costs are falling sharply. And in terms of the volume is probably still at a level which is not as high as that of a fossil fuel plant, or as high as that of a geothermal or a hydropower plant, which is running at the efficiency in the conversion of water and geothermal steam reserves to something like about between 85 to 95%. Then the final part of that is a capital recycling. And this is probably where some of the innovations are actually happening. And one of those innovations is in the energy transition mechanism. And what it does is simply say, I have a coal-fired plant here, and with a coal-fired plant, and this is what a Philippine company called ASEM, which is a renewable subsidiary of Ayala Corporation, one of the major conglomerate, not only in the Philippines, but also in Asia. they're simply saying, well, if somebody can take that contract off our hands, then we can commit that whatever money that we get from the divestment of the plant, yeah, we will commit to reinvest that purely on renewable energy projects. Now, in the case of the energy transition mechanism, that is actually a mechanism that was developed with Asian Development Bank, yeah, and the long and short of it is you have an asset like a coal-fired plant with 15 years to go. The 15 years is going to be transferred to an insurance company or a pension, earning an annuity type of revenue and paying ASEN to operate that. Yeah, so in a fast growth energy market like the Philippines, then you keep the coal-fired plants running for 15 years, yeah, but at the same time adding to whatever renewable technologies that are available. Yeah, and of course, I think the next step for that, what I could see is that multilateral agencies could be making use of blended finance to buy out the contract for an early phase out of the coal-fired plant as and when that kind of funding becomes available. The other, of course, is to repurpose the site or to reframe the use of the site and reconfigure that into energy hubs. Yeah? And out of that, one of the insights that came out is actually the whole question about benign neglect. Yeah? So if you have a technology or a power plant that is about, or at least suffering from some kind of an early signs of obsolescence, which is a case of some coal-fired plants, then the point of spending more on maintenance capex becomes less of a priority. And therefore, this is probably one of those cases where benign neglect is probably a legitimate strategy. Yeah, so next slide, please. So how do we reconfigure the profits? So by understanding the ecosystem, understanding the nature of the resources that we have, as we move from fossil fuel or some of the geocentric feedstock into intermittent feedstock, one of the important consideration here is that the nature of consolidating the production of power. In the case of fossil fuel and geocentric feedstock like geothermal and hydro, these are all highly centralized and highly concentrated form of production. In the case of intermittency, you have to harness from a dispersed type of resource. So therefore, the way the conversion process would happen and the way the logistics that would support that would also change, and with new legislation on social environmental compliance, then one can incorporate some of the additional investments that needs to be put in place. Yeah? And there are basically two ways companies or investors could respond to that. One way is to make the existing fossil fuel plants, let's say, more efficient or cleaner through technological advances, or one can reconfigure the way one delivers or meet the energy needs of society by basically getting out of the scope of the regulatory penalty, which in this case is the imposition of carbon tax. And that's how one moves into renewable. And at the end of the day, whatever type of combination companies may choose to have is to take into account the varying cost effectiveness of their different technologies, and also the substitution and the availability of that type of technology, and how the logistics would actually be supportive of the transition. And this is where economics becomes important. But in trying to figure out what the future may look like, one can focus on the emerging dilemmas as a problem, but I would rather look at the emerging dilemmas as an opportunity to actually look for areas where innovations can create the opportunities and the future market niches. Yeah. And so example of that, if waste disposal for solar panels that are about to become obsolete or about to be decommissioned, well, perhaps the opportunity is not in installing solar panels, given the late movers advantage or benefits that could be created that does not work for the early movers. Well, maybe the opportunity is in the recycling side of the business, or actually in the management of the waste, yeah, as solar farms are decommissioned. So what are some of the final takeaway that I'd like to share, which is in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I think creating the profitable niches today, I would encourage managers and policymakers to take a look at some of the lessons we can have with regards to the early or late movers and some of the conditions that will make that advantageous rather than force through policy actions a very linear kind of implementation of transition. Yeah? So in other words, it's better probably to leave that to people who has the capacity to move flexibly, and that is really the private sector and the managers. We need to look at connectivity, the access to networks, and the relationships and how that would change. And with regards to using the example of geothermal, I would say small is beautiful, and probably that's true for most of the other development and the technology front, because with the introduction of slim hole drilling capacity, yeah, for geothermal, then geothermal has become more accessible, yeah, not only for the smaller firms, but also more accessible and more viable to smaller markets, yeah, because the initial capital expenditure has gone down, and because it has gone down, then chances are some of the more innovative, or what one might call exotic financial structures like blended finance or resource insurance would become possible. Now think about portfolio supplies, not optimizing single projects. Yeah? Because with a portfolio of supplies, we're actually taking advantage of creating options, taking advantage of arbitrage. Yeah. And finally, as we move into implementing or formulating a strategy going forward, then the mindset will have to think in terms of a contextual decision. Yeah? And if we think in terms of the context of the decision we're trying to make, then it is possible for managers to actually consider benign neglect as a legitimate strategy for obsolescing technologies, adaptive moves, basically looking at ways to change, let's say, the way we deliver energy, the way we implement our strategy when market conditions change, and of course, never to take it for granted that in an oligopolistic market, the rivalry among firms would also influence how the value is being created. And finally, as far as mindset is concerned, managers would always have a choice whether to emphasize risk avoidance, or one could have a more positive attitude towards change by thinking of change as an arena to create opportunities. On that note, I'll pass you on to Volko.
Thank you, Dr. Ricardo. And now we would like to invite our special guest for the event, Professor Volko de Jong, to share on the global energy transition. So, Professor Volko, you may begin.
Well, thank you very much. It's for me an honor to assist Ricardo in this, I think, highly interesting subject of dynamic decision making. Well, you can see, of course, that working for the energy sector for many years already, I had the honor to set up a Master of Petroleum Business Engineering and a Master of Gas Business, and also Energy Transition and Leadership Master programs. We were confronted always with a sector where risk is not new, I think, but something that is already very well known for the big companies and also the smaller companies working in here. So basically what we see is that you work in the energy sector and you have to understand that you have a license to operate. That means your customers, the government, and all kind of other stakeholders should allow you to perform your business. And going forward, of course, we go from what you see here in a sector that is still highly dominated with fossil fuels to a dream of almost going to a zero emission energy sector. And doing that, of course, nobody can forecast what will happen. There will be new solutions, unexpected events, complete new paradigm shift, etc. And of course, we have the ambition to go to this zero emission, but in the end, we have to do things. And that means and at this moment in time in the world, there are a lot of fossil energy projects still going on, but also there are a lot of renewable energy projects all around the world. And the whole idea is, of course, how do we get there without losing our license to operate, or actually for new companies to get a new license to operate, which is highly complicated if you understand the enormous number of stakeholders involved in this game and the size of this game. And so then discussing with Ricardo, you understand that the whole issue of uncertainty, managing this uncertainty, is key. As an example, I'm living in the Netherlands, a country dominated by natural gas, because we live on top of one of the largest natural gas fields here in the European mainland. You can see in the old days, we set up this gas industry with what we call long-term contracts. We knew that a lot of things could go different, but especially if you look at Europe, basically there was a long-term contract between the Russian gas suppliers and the German industry. And based on these long-term contracts, people could manage the risk. One of the paradigm shifts, of course, that happened in the past decades, that we shift away from long-term contracts to spot markets. And being in the spot markets, at a certain moment, a lot of stakeholders didn't recognize that they were exposed to many risks in this game. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide and see how you can manage that. Oh, just a few things. I actually sent 5 slides, but this is the 10-slide presentation. That doesn't matter. I'll skip a few. This was the old situation in Europe. You had a gas infrastructure and you have electricity infrastructure. And these two infrastructures are somewhat separated, almost different cultures, different worlds that live together, but provided the energy to most of the stakeholders, most of the consumers, even not knowing much about the details, what was happening in this industry. Next slide, please. Now you end up in a completely different situation. Where we dream of is a highly integrated system. And this is actually happening in the Netherlands. Due to earthquakes, due to the Russian Ukraine war, and a lot of other things, and also the threat of climate change, the Dutch and the Germans and a lot of other countries in Europe are undertaking a very, very ambitious step towards a highly complicated energy system. You can see that suddenly we are dreaming of using hydrogen. We integrate a lot of offshore wind. Also in the North Sea, there will be a tremendous amount of wind parks that will provide energy. But also, all these steps will take a lot of decisions and are clearly not without risk. Just for example, if you would take the risk of building offshore wind parks, we never thought that, like what happened with Nord Stream a year ago, that these infrastructures can be attacked. So this is a very difficult world to make decision as a manager at this moment in time. Next slide. One of the ambitious projects in the Netherlands we have is, for example, introducing hydrogen. That we have the first hydrogen valley created in the north of the Netherlands, but also the port of Rotterdam. We are undertaking this ambitious plan to change, not only using gas, but using hydrogen as the main source for the industry. I'm involved in these projects, and one of the big challenges compared with natural gas that we introduced 50, 60 years ago is that suddenly we have to change the energy infrastructure over the whole of the energy value chain. So we ask producers to produce hydrogen. Where do you find these amount of hydrogen and ammonia, both in the Netherlands and around the world? We have to create a completely new transmission system where we use the old natural gas pipelines. And of course, the industry has to adapt and change its production from mainly natural gas, because we live on top of a natural gas, big natural gas field, towards hydrogen. And some of them will probably not even make this because it's very ambitious. So what we do is, how do we create such an infrastructure in, I think, only a limited time of 10, 15 years, which sounds very long, but if you take this industry, that is an enormous effort. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what it all boils up to, if you're somewhere in the previous decade, will my project still be viable? And I'm now saying 2025, but of course it could be even earlier. That suddenly, due to a lot of things that happen in this turbulent era, your project is not viable anymore. And there, I think the steps that Ricardo is talking about, being able to shift direction, is key. So we cannot do as we did with natural gas, take decades to build a new infrastructure and believe that will be viable for the next, say, 50 years. Yeah, and I worked a lot with Professor Bracken. It's on the bottom of the slide. Basically, I'm also an econometrician. I always learned forecasting the future is very difficult. But he said the types of events is very simple. You talk about business as usual, surprise, and fatal surprise. So be aware that something can happen, even with wind or solar or whatever, that suddenly blocks your solution. And you have to think about this and being able to make dynamic decisions. I think that's crucial. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is, of course, the whole issue that we are working with within this is one of the traditional mindset of risk management in our sector. On the one hand, you want to have security of supply. Well, if you start migrating in the way that we are doing now in Europe and in the Netherlands and basically all around the world, suddenly, especially for people like living in the Netherlands who are used to having complete security of supply. We had this swing field, the natural gas field. If it was cold in the winter, you just turn up the production of the natural gas, and you can guarantee that even in a week with -20, nobody will even suffer. We sold it maybe in the beginning for 4 cents per cubic meter, which was extremely cheap. The other risk is, of course, is it affordable? Can you still pay this? Are you competitive? Are industries willing to work in your country because you have such abundant and cheap energy available? And of course, you have the environmental impact. So everybody understands that the environmental compatibility is very important, and I think sometimes even underestimated. We still talk about 2050, but if you think in uncertainty, I say it maybe in the next decade already a big problem, and it maybe take 2000 in the next century to bring us in trouble. Nobody knows this, but these risks are there. But what you can see in the middle, it's called acceptance. In the Netherlands, we shift toward these environmental protection issues. And then it turns out that gas prices and all these things become big things, and the risk in both, say, the security of supply and competitiveness go up. So that takes a lot of flexibility, completely in line with where Ricardo is talking about. Next slide, please. And this is, of course, what you learn if you go to a Master of Petroleum Business Engineering. This is not new. So if you do something, it's all about risk analysis and decision making. And look at the things that you see on the left, the top, geopolitical developments. Well, I worked a lot with Russia, and I always dreamed of building a relation. I still do this, dream building a relation there, but suddenly, from a very strong relation, you end up in a big geopolitical issue. The same is happening with the US and China. So suddenly these political, geopolitical developments become crucial in your mind. Tomorrow we are discussing also in the Netherlands, we build this offshore wind parks. What happens if we are too dependent on, say, the Russian situation or the Chinese situation? Is the risk too big? Then a lot of investors will say, no way, we want to do this. The next thing to your top, energy policies and regulation. Well, one of the big problems is if you don't stabilize regulations, these policies will drive you crazy. So the investors will say, this is too turbulent for me. I will not invest on a large scale. Technical innovations, there are so many solutions offered at this moment in time, and you will come. That will be a big impact. And all these things, also the business strategies that you will see will end up. So what is the key issue? That is, you need this value creation, which was key always in the industry, the business skills, all these things into cultural skills. Don't underestimate that. And we need to, of course, the whole risk intelligence and dynamic investments and decision-making skills. If you don't have these skills in a turbulent, I always love the word VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, that you simply will not be able to run a business in the next decades to come, unless you put the risk on somebody else's shoulders, being the government or some of the other big players. Next slide, please. Yep. Yeah, so and then if you do this, you don't only have to challenge this from a technical or economic point. In the end, it's all about leadership as well. Who will follow whom in this game? I think the natural gas industry always underestimated that you cannot take your industry for granted, because if you're not visible in this world, a lot of people will take other decisions. So a lot of the reality is that the media controls a lot of what is being said. It's not the government, it's not even the company. So you have to deal with these things. And also you have to be able to implement it in this world. So we talk a lot and we make a lot of regulation, but that doesn't mean that we are capable of implementing it, introducing yet another risk. Next slide, please. And of course, I didn't mention to tell this, but I always love this one. Be aware that you live in a world where all these stakeholders have their own values, assumptions, beliefs, and expectations. This is key in understanding why it is so difficult to change. Most people don't have time to look at all details of regulation and what is happening. So they live in their own assumptions and they look at the world through this. In the beginning, a lot of people neglect climate change. That is not necessarily bad or wrong. That is something that they believe. Yeah, so and this world is even much more difficult, and that's why to make a transition, and it's more volatile, because it's sometimes mentioned culture eats strategy for lunch. So if you want to set this dynamic investment strategy, a way of working, you need to convince people that have been trained in a way that they use the net present value and all the certainties and contracting to make their decisions. So that takes the people who have the guts to do this. Next slide, please. So in the end, and I think there I want to stop, because in the end, this is the show for Ricardo. This is, of course, what you are faced with in the energy sector. We live now in 2023, and we have to find out, where is this world going? You still feel, and that's the same traditional way of thinking, that a lot of focus is still in the large initiative with focus on production and centralized production. But also, I believe in the energy hubs as well. So there will be a combination of both decentralized and centralized production. Take into account the important lessons of what Oxford is always telling about a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex world. You need to go more into decentralized decision making. It's very risky to be making decision in a centralized world, because you don't get 15 years to create a hydrogen network or to create big other infrastructures. You will need to move fast and flexible. And then I think the decentralized production could be key. And of course, there will be a mix of these two in the futures. And the whole decision-making process and dynamic decision process is key to manage your company in this world. I think this is basically I want to say, and I congratulate Ricardo also with his book, which is fascinating because it tackles these issues in great detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Volko. So now we would like to invite Dr. Ricardo, Professor Volko, and also Professor Rama, who will be the moderator of the panel discussion.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Ricardo and Volko, for very, very fascinating presentations, which were of great interest to generalists like me, who are not from the energy sector. I have a couple of questions for Ricardo and one for Volko. My first question to Ricardo is, if we look at the animal to machines transition, so what that suggests is that emerging innovations could completely change how we consume and produce energy. Now, looking beyond wind and solar and these technologies that have already, been adopted now for many years around the world, can you see any emerging technology or any couple of emerging technologies that could portend as big a shift from as there was from animals to machines?
Yeah. So I'll start with that one. So when we talk about the transition from animals to machine, I think one of the important aspects of that is that innovation tends to happen at the periphery, not as a direct attack on the incumbents. And the simple reason for that is at the periphery, you're always operating under the radar screen, in a manner of speaking. And because you're operating under the radar screen, the dominant players is probably not going to care too much about what you're doing. And oftentimes what happens is at the margins, when an innovation becomes accepted, and I think connecting that to what Volko was mentioning about license to operate, so let's say there is a license to operate that is being granted even by a small segment of the marketplace, a small segment of the society, then slowly but surely, some kind of a market positioning would gain traction. Yeah. And as that niche becomes bigger, then oftentimes it's too late for the incumbent to respond. And also, in the case of the incumbent, there's also the question about, is it worth my while to basically attack a small player that has a very small part, which is really just operating with a very small area of the market that I'm interested in? And chances are the answer is no. Yeah. So this is where this brings me to probably the conversation with Antonio Brufau, who's the CEO of Repsol. Yeah. One of the questions I raised with him is, well, if the world is going electric, yeah, away from, let's say, fossil fuel, how come you're not revisiting the merger of Repsol and Gas Natural? Yeah, or Gas Natural at this stage is one of the largest power generating companies in not only in Spain, but also in Europe. And the answer was actually a very simple one. He said, well, if you're trying to merge two companies with legacy positions, yeah, one in oil and gas industry, the other is in the power generation industry, then you'll probably be focusing your attention on getting out of that legacy position before you can move into the new promising areas. Yeah, so this brings us to how innovation is actually occurring, yeah, in the marketplace. One of those areas is offshore wind. Yeah, offshore wind is still considered to be an emerging technology, but the advantage of offshore wind is that the abundance of wind in the offshore area, especially in the deep water area, is actually offering the potential, yeah, of having a very high volume of electricity being generated from renewable sources. Yeah, so if you're talking about being able to convert the amount of wind that you receive, and say 65% of that is going to be turned into electricity, then that is a more interesting technology to nurture than, let's say, something that would convert 15 to 20% or 22% of sunlight into energy. The other, of course, is the wave energy. Now, wave energy is not new. It has had its own share of failures in the past. But I think as technology becomes smaller, to make the wave, to harness the power of energy from wave, then probably if we're talking about the next decade or so, that wave energy becomes a possible complement to offshore wind. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Ricardo. Those are very interesting thoughts. So offshore wind could solve the intermittency problem of onshore wind. My second question to you is, what you described about the rational decision to delay investments in solar because the profits foregone might actually be smaller than the capex saved through delay, is a fascinating one. And you spoke about late movers benefits, right?
Yeah.
So my question to you is, of course, the late movers benefit accrues to the decision-making firm, but is there a societal cost here? And can policymakers intervene to tilt the balance in such a way that the decision makers actually choose to make the investment rather than delay it?
Okay, let's talk about societal costs, yeah, which is probably the easier part of the question to answer, ironically. If you have a society where the only alternative is solar, then yes, there is a cost. But if you're operating in a society where it has alternatives, and the alternatives are actually going to be better in the sense that they produce more power, which is clean power, yeah, compared to what solar can produce, then the answer is no. The societal cost can be mitigated. Now, the other aspect of that, of course, is there a way to switch the decision from defer to commit? Yeah. Yes, of course. And that's where subsidies come in. Yeah. And if subsidies become rather generous, at least for the early movers, then it's just a question of calculating some of the numbers. Yeah. Which is, if you're foregoing this much of revenue, let's say you're saving 20, yeah, by not investing today, and next year you're saving another 20. So let's say in 2 years' time, you'll end up, let's say, a cumulative saving of about 40. Yeah. Now, if the foregone revenue is, let's say, 10 plus 10 is 20, you're still ahead by 20. Yeah. So the theory is, if you subsidize it by 30 and you lose it if you don't invest, then you say, well, of course, I'll invest today. Yeah. Because 10 plus 30 is 40. Yeah. And if I get it on year 1 instead of year 2, that's a good deal. Yeah.
Interesting. So basically, the delay in decision making also is a function of what is the alternative, is what I gather from your answer. If the alternative is another clean source, then maybe the societal cost is not that high.
Correct.
Let me now come to Volko. Volko, your penultimate slide and your discussion about geopolitical developments was actually very fascinating, because as you know, in the last 3 years, since the outbreak of COVID, one of the expressions that has become very, very widely used in the business circles is supply chain resiliency. So the idea that when you configure your supply chain, minimizing cost is no longer the only criterion. Okay, you need to think about the resiliency of the supply chain. And your discussion about the geopolitical developments such as the Russia-Ukraine war completely turning on their head, the economics of energy, for example, in Europe, led me to the question, should we also think about energy supply resiliency in the future, where cost is an important factor in our decision, but not the only one?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's highly interesting and a complete paradigm shift that suddenly, compared with 10 years ago, this is a big issue. So you can see there's a war for all the basic supplies that we need. So everybody is looking. We cannot be dependent on one country for our resources. We of course have the issue of transport. So as soon as you have to transport long distance, you are vulnerable in these kind of situations. Even if you look at the Ukraine-Russian war, you can see that part of the Russian strategy is to demolish the energy infrastructure, because if you stop the electricity and gas infrastructure to delivering to the customers, then suddenly you're in big trouble. And it sounds easy, but being dependent for 70-80%, for example, from chip production from Taiwan and China, you know that if something goes wrong there, the risk is bigger. And I always say the whole problem is you only have a maximum insurance capability. So if you start putting money into this direction, you cannot put it in another direction. You can also say we need an army to defend ourselves. So we have to pay 2% of our income to the army. So if you want too much, you end up with such a large bill that simply the consumers cannot pay. But I think this geopolitical issue is completely new. I coach, for example, the Dutch ambassador in Kuwait with this team, and he told me, as an ambassador, we never discussed geopolitics anymore in the past 10 years, and suddenly it's a topic again.
Yeah.
And there I love this a slide with this value, assumption, belief, and expectations. Be aware that somewhere underneath, in my classes, I always called it, in Europe, we showed 50, 60 years of James Bond. That was the Russian, and all the others were the enemy. And somewhere, so if something happens, suddenly you end up in a kind of enemy situation, which is very scary. So yeah, you have to take it into account, and much more, and that means that these big infrastructures are very, the expected value of big infrastructure simply has declined.
Yes. Ricardo, any thoughts on energy supply resiliency, just to follow up on Volko's remarks?
Yeah, energy resiliency is actually a very important consideration. And for that reason, that's essentially the premise that I have when I am promoting the whole idea that when we talk about energy, we're talking about a portfolio of supplies, as opposed to trying to champion one type of energy source versus another. Yeah, because I think my starting point here is, are we in a world wherein one should believe that fossil fuel is the evil incarnate and renewable is a savior of humanity? And I would say no, because that is a load of nonsense, sorry to say. Yeah, but rather, when one talks about resiliency, one has to look at fossil fuel, renewables, and any emerging technologies as one continuum. Yeah, so therefore, portfolio is the way to go. Yeah.
Great. Huiin, do we have you compiled the questions that the audience has asked? Maybe this is a good time to raise them for the speakers.
I think we have something from Dimitri, right?
Okay, please. Ricardo, could you take that? I mean,
yeah. Or Dimitri, would you like to ask that question? Or shall I answer it based on what you have written? Okay, so Dimitri's question is, how do we account for the lag in legislation policies making the emerging dilemmas more appealing for the business? Okay, I'll premise my answer in the following. Yeah, so I'm quite open about where my own ideological bias comes from. Yeah, my starting point is that we are working in a market economy, and a market economy is probably still the more efficient way, imperfect as it is, in allocating resources and probably giving the appropriate rewards to the risk takers. So in this case, the example that I would probably refer to in answering the question of Dimitri, I think it's not more of a question of government giving or underwriting all the risks by having all the policies that needs to be in place, but rather for policymakers to be enabling the optimization or the expansion of access to opportunities. Yeah. Now, so in that case, taking the example of ASEN, which is the renewable energy company of Ayala Corporation, they developed the implementation of the energy transition mechanism, yeah, which is recycling the capital from their coal-fired plant, release that equity in order for them to invest in an expanding portfolio of renewables. The policy did not exist for that type of for that type of mechanism. So what they have done is basically work with Asian Development Bank, work with the central bank in the Philippines, and work with some of the private sector entities who are willing to take on the risks. And at the end of the day, cut a long story short, they came up with a package that they sat down and discussed with the Philippine government, who is quite supportive about the idea. Yeah, so hence the end result of that is without taking any subsidies from the government, it became a viable private sector approach to raising financing, yeah, and at the same time, also satisfying the resiliency of the system by not taking out the coal-fired capacity immediately, but rather phasing it out over a predetermined number of years. Yeah. And the rest of that is history. So ASEN is the first company ever in the world to have actually not only considered ETN as a viable way to raising financing, but it is the first company to commercially implement that.
Volko, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to add something, because I feel this whole issue of legislation and policies is one of the big dilemmas of our, especially I know most about the Western society that we have. If you want to change legislation, it always takes time. And of course, that creates a lot of safety for a lot of people involved in maybe the disadvantages of new solutions. But on the other hand, it slows down a lot of implementation. For example, I knew when with LNG, with hydrogen, if you want to build a filling station, in the beginning, if there's no legislation, you're part of the most dangerous substances and the legislation for this. So it takes time, and governments should always wonder, when do we have to speed up legislation and when do we have less detail in it? So if you end up in a situation of war, of course, there is no legislation anywhere. But if we end up in very big trouble in climate change, how on earth can you make legislation more flexible and more dynamic almost than we had in the past? Always, like in the Netherlands, onshore wind, before there is a ban on onshore wind, because a lot of people are fighting it for very good reasons, and the legislation is there to stop wind production. So yeah, I think this is a key issue.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Volko and Ricardo. Jerome Evangelista has a question, but I think your question may need some clarification, Jerome. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, Doc, Ricardo. Hi, Volko.
Hi, Jerome, how are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. So actually, my question is, I can imagine that decisions like a probit logic model, it's a yes or no. But my question is, what key variable do you want to consider that the energy transition is for that variable? When you hit that value, it's too late for firms to react. And what would that be? Would that be cost of energy or capex, or what? How would you imagine that model, and what variable would that be?
Okay.
You mean when it would become too late for firms to react?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, Ricardo, do you?
Okay. Let me put that in a framework of a financial, of a financial logic. Yeah. Now, if you look at it on financial logic, I think my starting point is, what are the variables that are actually important to allow you to have a sufficiently high profit, yeah, that would enable you to recover what you have invested. Yeah. So that means you're down to basically few defined variables: price, volume, cost, time is which is time to recover, and basically the other one is volatility. Yeah, so now you can model all of that in a binomial tree if you want to go technical about it. Now, so then the second stage of the analysis or the thinking is to say, so what are some of the geopolitical factors that would actually influence the volume? Yeah, that would influence the price, that would influence the cost, and what kind of policy would actually influence, let's say, interest rates, for example, is one of those critical variables. And what kind of policy would actually involve the availability of logistics? Yeah? Because at the end of the day, any forecast of volumes that you have will become very theoretical if there's no way for you to connect what you produce with the market. Yeah. Yeah. So if you have a disruption, or the transmission line doesn't exist, or it takes you 10 years to get access to transmission line, then you have to probably rethink, yeah, your whole project and your whole investment. Now, when is it too late and when is it too early? I think the example I would give there is the example of Drax. Yeah. So Drax is a company that bought one of the largest coal-fired power plant in the UK. So AES, an American company, decided that it would be good to enter the UK market. And one way to enter the UK market is to get involved in buying the largest power plant, which happens to be coal. Yeah. Now, so you're making a bet, you're making a strategic bet, yeah, that coal will be around for much longer. Yeah. But as it so happened, legislation changed, the regulation also changed. Yeah. And before you know it, coal became less viable and less profitable. It doesn't no longer meet the financial objectives of AES. So what they did was shut down the coal-fired plant, but at the same time repurpose that into another kind of plant, yeah, which is using pellets, which is using biomass. So whether it's too late or too early, it's really dependent on your capacity as a firm, as a manager, to repurpose, reframe, and reconfigure your business.
May I add one comment to that?
Sure.
One of the fascinating things, of course, first of all, I'm coach within business coach, and they use effectuation. That they call this, when you start, you should think about what they call affordable losses. And one of the things I had the honor that Paul Bracken from Yale was in our program was this is also true on the scale of a government or any other. And the key issue he mentioned, I already said about business as usual, surprise and fatal surprise. He said, it's a way of thinking. He called it core scenarios. You have to think about what could happen. And he mentioned the nice example, or it's not a nice example, the example of 9/11. He said, nobody would ever think that Wall Street would go down. And he said, and the strange thing is everybody with the CIA and everyone was saying, how could this happen? But that's not interesting. The only interesting is, if it happens, what can I do? And basically what Ricardo is saying is the same thing on whatever level you are. Don't only think about the thing that you are a big success, but very cool. Keep in mind that things can go completely different. And what are your core scenarios that could happen, and how could you add this flexibility so you know what to do? So Paul said, we understood that something goes wrong with Wall Street, you have to call this, do this, etc. So there at least is a plan B to act, even if something that happens is not obvious, because nobody can understand it. And that's very difficult, because as a business person or as a person as a whole, we have this I always call this Titanic syndrome. We will not sink. Nothing can happen to us. And of course, that avoids you from taking the measures. Okay, I need saving equipment on board, etc. And if you don't take this seriously, you can end up in a lot of trouble. But if you do it in the right way, you can even turn it into an advantage. I think that's the lesson of Ricardo.
Let me thank you, Ricardo and Volko, and I hope, Jerome, that your question has been answered.
Yeah,
So,
it's it was answered very well. I like the build the edge cases, the spectrum. When you define the spectrum, you can navigate in between. Right?
Of course,
so
of course.
Yeah, great. So let me. I know that Ricardo is a proponent of real options thinking, and that has in some ways underpinned both his books. So my question to you, Ricardo, is that fundamentally, of course, real options allows you to be more flexible, to delay, to switch, to abandon. But are some energy technologies more amenable to a real options approach than others? Because, as you know, real options involves fractionalizing your investments over time. And if there are some investments, I don't know if a coal-fired plant could be fractionalized, or the investment would have to be a lumpy investment for the long term. What are your thoughts on whether real options is more easily applicable to certain types of energy technologies rather than others?
The short answer is yes, it is for most technologies, with one exception: nuclear. Yeah, and the reason nuclear would be difficult to implement real option reasoning is because, first of all, in terms of the operational characteristics of nuclear, even the smaller version now, you have to run it 24 hours a day. Yeah, because it's so inflexible as a technology that when you ramp up or ramp down the volume, it's going to be excessively expensive. Yeah. So then if you cannot ramp it down and you cannot ramp it up, there's no flexibility. And if you're locked in to that kind of cost base, then you're really back to the one-shot deal, yeah, or a now or never type of decision. Yeah. So basically, what happened, just like the example of British Energy, which is a UK nuclear company, which we happen to be, during my banking days, we happen to help privatize as well. Yeah. So one of the issues about British Energy at the time was the inflexibility, of the cost base, the inflexibility of the operating base. So the question is, under a dynamic market where prices would go up or down, what happens at the time when there is persistent low prices that would prevail in the system? And of course, the answer at the time, or the accepted wisdom at the time, is it will never happen. And because it will never happen, so therefore British Nuclear will never go bankrupt. And I said, I hope that is the case. But of course, that was the case for a few years, until the market collapsed. And there's a very long period of time where prices are actually excessively low. And the rest of that is history. British Energy no longer exists as a company. It has to be renationalized, and the government, I think, is trying to figure out what to do with it.
Great.
And just to finish that comment, I guess, as far as the others is concerned, yes, generally speaking, a lot of the technologies have become smaller. Even coal-fired plants have become smaller. Yeah. So there's such a thing as a 300 megawatt type of coal-fired plant. Gas is down to that range, and we talk about renewable, that's even smaller.
Yeah.
We have
And
one
may I
last
add one
question. Yeah, sure.
One comment to that. Of course, the thing is that you can see also with nuclear that at a certain moment you can say, okay, I want to have it on a ship. If it's floating, at least you can go to another market. There are alternatives instead of trying to build something onshore which is not movable anymore. Even there, it's always looking for options that would increase your flexibility.
Yeah, great. Let's take one last question. Amy, do we have time for one last question from the audience?
Yes.
Yes. Edward Du asked the question. The Philippine president recently endorsed battery energy storage systems as an alternative solution to achieve energy security. What are your thoughts?
Okay.
Ricardo, you go first.
Okay. As far as battery is concerned, I think the cost is still expensive. Yeah. And I think in your experience, Rama, during your time in China, I think you have also experienced the massive decline in lithium battery costs. Yeah. Now, but in spite of having fallen so much, battery storage, as from an economics perspective, at least, would probably take some time before it becomes financially viable on its own, without any subsidies. The other part, of course, is the technological aspect. Yeah, you can store energy, a limited amount of energy, and if you're just looking at it for rebalancing the peak and the trough of the system, for a small system, that might not be a problem. Yeah, but when you're talking about a system involving a whole region or a whole country, then that becomes a bit problematic. Yeah, because of the state of the technology right now.
Yeah. Can I add one last one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
I live here just next to a big project called Stock, where the Dutch government and the Dutch Gasunie is storing hydrogen in a salt cavern. And of course, it's mind-boggling to see the amount of energy that you can store in such a cavern. Of course, hydrogen is much less efficient than bringing renewable energy direct to the market. But of course, the lithium batteries only give you the capability to store for a limited amount of time. And what you lack, of course, is strategic reserves and etc. That if suddenly the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, and I always say this is climate change, ladies and gentlemen, so nobody can forecast the weather in 1 week from now. So some strange things might happen. So these long seasonal storages are crucial in your system. And hydrogen or pump storage are at least ways to create such things and should be a part of your storage strategy to guarantee longer term storages and strategic reserves. And they are much cheaper than the battery solutions at this moment in time.
Yeah. And I think I would probably add one point. When we're talking about the seasonal or longer period type of storage, you as a manager of a system, of an energy system, you basically have a number of choices. Yeah. One generic choice is, do you store the fuel or do you store the output, which is kilowatt hour? Yeah. Chances are it would be a lot cheaper, and the technology is already there, the infrastructure is already there, is to store the fuel. And when I talk fuel, I'm not really limiting ourselves to gas. Water and geothermal is a cheap option.
Thank you. I think fascinating webinar. And I would like to personally thank for their very, very insightful discussion. And let me now hand it back to Amy and Huiyin. Please, Amy.
Yes, thank you so much. We would like to really thank our supportive audience for staying with us, and especially want to thank Dr. Ricardo, Professor Volko, and also Professor Rama for the very informative dialogue. So for today, do check out Dynamic Decisions, which is on a special sale of 20% off. You can put in the special promo code valid from today until the 30th of April 2023. And do get your copy. I think it's a very insightful book. Professor Ricardo worked very, very hard on it. And thank you for joining us today. We really look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank
It was
you.
a pleasure being here.
Yeah, a lot of great questions. I think today was very insightful, even for people who may not be very familiar in this industry.